Hey, welcome back to video number 8. We're going to pick up where we left off, and if you don't remember, Kennedy was just assassinated. Now, after Kennedy is assassinated by who? Lee Harvey Oswald. Johnson takes on the civil rights movement. Lyndon B. Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson, right? So if you guys are following along, we are on slide 578. 578. So after Kennedy's death, LBJ becomes president and is going to really work on passing the civil rights bill that was created by Kennedy. It does pass. It's one of these legacy things. Like, yeah, it didn't pass when Kennedy was alive, but it definitely passes when he died because people kind of like, you know what? Yeah, we'll pass his last legislation um, and move forward. Now Johnson's an interesting guy, and Johnson can be there's a lot that happens from this. So let's look at Johnson's Great Society. That's the next slide. That's slide 579. Now, in 1964, Johnson pushes for something called the Great Society. Now, this legislation pushes and focuses on the total elimination of poverty and racial injustice. Now, how do you do that, right? Well, he says, we're going to invest in rebuilding the slums, right? The ghettos, whatever you want to call them, wherever minorities are living. We're going to give them food assistance, so food stamps. We're going to raise their income, and we're going to give more help to those in minority communities. For single mothers and these communities, they're going to be given more money, right? You're a single mother, here's some extra money. Now, there is some backlash to this. And I guys want you to think of devil's advocate here. So, yes, it sounds great when you say, you know what, we're going to invest in these slum areas, we're going to help people who can't eat. Yeah, that's all great stuff. But when you're saying, we're going to give money to those that are least fortunate, how does that help people pick themselves back up? This is kind of that whole argument of is capitalism good? Is socialism good? Because giving money to people for free is socialism. And at the end of the day, we're not a socialist country. So it's kind of crazy. At the time, the Great Society, this whole thing was passed. 70 to 80% of African American minorities and pretty much all people, they grew up in married households, right? Both their parents were together. Today, 40% of children are born out of wedlock, which means that almost half of our young people, half of our people born, um, are born to parents who are not married, and 25% of children are uh, children of divorce. So you're looking at right now 65% of kids born without both parents. Now, of the 100% of that, 40% of all children have no biological father in their lives, and that might be some of you guys. It's kind of crazy just to think of that. Almost half of our population's children don't have a father in the household. It's crazy. So, the Great Society was meant to do good things, and it has helped, but at the same time, it's also enabled people. So, it's just something you gotta think about. Play some devil's advocate with you there. A fun fact, I want to say like 70% of all people in prison come from single parent households, which that's a pretty telling thing, but neither here nor there. So, anyway, let's move on. So, the legacy of the civil rights movement. A lot of people feel like these changes were taking too long. Like I said, before the whole black nationalism thing happens, people are like, man, these things that are happening are just dragging on and on and on. Even after the civil rights movement ends, right? So like there's this it's still not equal. But segregation now is illegal, and that's good. Voter registration among blacks was at an all-time high. And really a light was shed on the problems that the country had as far as race goes, and specifically in the South, but across the whole country. Um, But the civil rights movement ends with the death of Martin Luther King Jr. Now, between 1970 and 1975, the number of black elected officials increases by 88%, which is awesome. There's going to be black mayors, black congressmen. It's going to be really awesome to see this movement. And you got to think of this big picture, right? So we're talking about the legacy, right? The legacy of the civil rights movement. The Civil War ends, right? So let's go way back to 1865. The Civil War ends, right? All these people are just freed from slavery, the slaves, right? Within about 100 years, people start fighting for their rights, right? And obviously, there's people fighting for their rights before this, but really, the civil rights movement happens. So this is within a generation or two. You go from slavery to almost working towards equality. And then you go, barely 30 years after that, 30, 40 years after that, and we have the first black president. This is awesome. This is awesome, right? It's so cool how this happens. America is so awesome about just seeing a problem and fixing it. And that doesn't mean everybody is going to be on board with it. Obviously not. But it's awesome that we can do this. Within 200 years, we went from slaves to black president. That's awesome. Not awesome that they were slaves, but awesome that we could grow from that. So let's move forward. We're going to move away from the civil rights movement and kind of go back to looking at not civil, Cold War kind of stuff. Now, in the 1960s, so we're going back in time a little bit. Bear with me. I told you all this stuff kind of crosses over. There is something called the counterculture. Now, in the 1960s, children born after World War II, this is going to be their kind of coming of age. Now, these are going to be all baby boomers. This is probably the largest population boom in American history. And a lot of them create a new culture that is very different from what their parents had. Um, the World War II, those young men and women, those are called the Greatest Society. In the 1960s, they move away from this. A counterculture emerges, and these are young people who want to have peace and love and freedom and no war and all this stuff. Yeah. So this generation really changes how the world views drugs, sex, music, and war itself. World War II, you come home as a hero. Vietnam, Korean War, people look at you like a murderer. It's pretty crazy how that happens. So, in protest to the Vietnam War. So, Vietnam War is going on in the 60s, and in 1964, there's a bunch of students at UC Berkeley become very angry when the school refuses them to hand out pamphlets about civil rights and about anti-war. So in December of that same year, 1964, students take over the administration building to protest. 700 students are going to be arrested, and Berkeley is really seen as this center for freedom of speech, where you can't shut us down just because we say something different than you. And UC Berkeley would keep this mantra for years and years and years, actually up until very recently. If you guys ever want to look at something interesting, go ahead and type in UC Berkeley riots. It's a very interesting thing. It's a school of free speech, but they are rioting and literally shutting down people from coming to their school and talking about things that they disagree with. It's very interesting. Go ahead, look at it. But that's UC Berkeley, and this is part of the counterculture. They don't want to be part of this warmongering, Cold War. They don't like it, right? Um, so in 1968, so we've kind of moved past the civil rights movement, but we still have the counterculture going on just a little bit. We really wouldn't get too much. We're not going to get too much into hippies. You know who they are. But there's an election in 1968. It's pretty big. So This election is between Richard Nixon and Robert Kennedy, the brother of late John F. Kennedy. Now, Kennedy is going to be the favorite. People are like, woohoo, another Kennedy, let's do it, yay. But he's also assassinated in like the early stages of his campaign. The Kennedys have crappy luck. Just um, JFK's killed, his brother's killed. I think his other brother was killed too. Um, his son, I think, died recently, and then like his granddaughter is now missing. It's just a terrible thing. So the Kennedys have had a rough go at it. But once Kennedy's assassinated, Nixon has a pretty easy road to victory. Um, he wins with 302 electoral votes. Now he only gets 43% of the popular vote, but he does get the electoral college. And it's really interesting. You say, okay, how does he only get 43% of the popular vote, but gets 302 electoral votes? That means that the majority of states voted for him, but the bigger states didn't. And this is something called the silent majority. Now, if you ever want to know how, let me retract. I'm sorry. There's this movement. There's this counterculture we talked about, right? There's these protests in college campuses about war and civil rights movement. And this counterculture is the loudest voice. So who are you going to see? Who do you think you're going to see in the news the most? You're going to see people with the loudest voice. Most Americans are not that. And he goes, you know what? I know I don't appeal to this counterculture, but I do appeal to regular middle class working people. And these are not people who are going to be on the news, rioting, protesting, and whatnot. These are people who know what they want and vote for it, even though maybe don't think it'll happen. And we saw this in the 2016 election, right? Everyone's like, "Ah, oh, Hillary Clinton's going to win," and then the silent majority ended up voting for Trump. So it's a very similar kind of thing. So silent majority is kind of an interesting thing. Nixon always looks to the silent majority for support. He knows that there's people out there who are on his side that are not mainstream, but have his similar ideology at hand. I talked about how the counterculture is really against the war in Vietnam. And when Nixon is elected president in June of 1969, he adopts a new policy called Vietnamization. Vietnamization. Say it with me. Vietnamization. Which means removing American soldiers in Vietnam and replacing them with South Vietnamese soldiers. It's just this turnover, right? People don't want us to be there. We don't want to be there, but we can't just up and leave. So I say, okay, we're gonna transition from us. We're gonna get more Vietnamese soldiers to fight the North Vietnamese. Um, yeah. Now, even though Nixon's removing soldiers, he refuses to lose a war and actually increases attacks, bombing wise, flyover plane attacks. Um, Now the war doesn't end, but there are a decrease in American casualties, which makes people happy, right? They don't, less killing of Americans is a good thing. Um, but really interesting is just he's kind of trying to pull back and appease the counterculture while at the same time trying to win and be successful. Now that does not mean that the counterculture doesn't see this as a joke, as a ploy. They say, no, Nixon, we know what you're doing here, and we don't like it. So we're gonna have more rallies at colleges. And remember, colleges are always the people that are craziest. Like even now, we'll look at colleges; they're all crazy. Um, Tension between anti-war activists in colleges and law and order supporters are going to reach a peak in 1970. So protesters are they're at Kent State and they're breaking windows and setting fires, throwing rocks at police. Now the police are like, you know what, we're gonna try to break this up. They start throwing some tear gas in there, trying to break up the crowd. And the police end up moving to the top of a hill and end up opening fire on protesters. And this is terrible, right? The police should not open live ammunition on protesters that are just, obviously they're acting crazy. They're breaking windows and rioting a little bit, but that doesn't give you a reason or right to shoot somebody. So the open fire ends up killing two protesters and two innocent bystanders. And this is a pretty big deal. And this isn't the only time it happens. Something very similar happens in Mississippi at Jackson State. Two dead and 11 wounded by police fire into the crowd of protesters. This just is not right. And this is terrible. And it's a really bad look on sorry, police and law and order and the government itself. So that's all going on. Eventually, the counterculture hippie movement, it's going to calm down. But there's some really interesting stuff that goes on with Nixon. So there's this thing called Watergate. Watergate is a hotel. All right, and there's a Watergate scandal. So I'm gonna walk you through it real fast, and then we'll probably stop after this one, but we'll give a look at it. So, 1972, toward the end of Nixon's first term, there's a break-in that happens at the Democratic National Committee's headquarters at Watergate offices, um, and it was perpetrated by five guys. So there's five guys. They break into the Watergate hotel, their offices, to kind of see what they can find. Now they're arrested, um, and they're in possession of money linked to Nixon's reelection fund. Retro. Always track the money. You'll find out who's guilty. So, with the link between the break in to Nixon's presidency, Congress says, okay, Nixon, um, we want something from you. Now, Nixon is pretty much famous of recording everything in the Oval Office. And so they say, hey, we want all of your recordings that you have because there's rumors that you know and you have direct knowledge of these break-ins. Well, Nixon gives the tapes to Congress, and it gives evidence that Nixon did have direct knowledge of the act and resigned from office prior to being impeached. So, yeah, he kind of got caught with his pants down, handed the cookie jar, red-handed, whatever you want to call it. So, yeah, the Watergate was this big scandal. He was trying to get dirt on his opponents. It got tracked back to him. It's this big thing. Again, we're just gonna kind of gloss over it because it's interesting, but I don't have the time to go over it with you guys. So yeah, Nixon resigns. It's pretty crazy. So when we come back, we're going to look at the end of the Cold War, talk about Reagan, and really just kind of move forward from there. So I know this video was really choppy as far as where we're going. It jumps around a little bit, but I have faith that you guys can go ahead and look at your notes, read through, and kind of keep up. Like I said, it's it's an interesting time and it gets a little weird, but stick with it. You guys are doing great. Keep it up. Keep watching these videos, um, and have a good one.